So it's currently 8 a.m. for me. I'm based in Seoul, South Korea. But I imagine for the most of you, it's probably the afternoon or the evening. Feel free to let me know in the chat where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. And I don't think we'll have a lot of attendees today. I think the attendance rate was kind of low this time around. But that's more time for questions from a smaller group. Cool. Do you have daylight savings in Texas? Or does everywhere in the States have daylight savings time? Unfortunately, yeah, I know. I'm originally based in Toronto, Canada, and this is my first time being in a country or a city where we don't have daylight savings, and it was like really magically life-changing. Because yeah, they don't have it in Korea. Okay. Cool. Let's get started. Yeah, so welcome everybody to the Launch School Prep workshop series. This is week 2, so therefore lesson 2 of the workshops. So we're looking at functions and variable scope today. Just a reminder that these workshops are standalone, so they don't necessarily require you to attend the previous ones to attend the current one, but we are working sequentially through the Introduction to JavaScript book that Launch School provides publicly on their website. And this workshop is the most applicable if you're going through that the Launch School prep course. So yeah, if you're not in the prep course, you can definitely have a lot of takeaways, but I think it is the most applicable if you are taking the prep course. My name is Grace, and I'm a TA here at Launch School. But like most other TAs at Launch School, I'm also a student as well in the JavaScript track myself. So I've also been in the same shoes as you are now, completely new to the prep course and kind of like working my way on this like journey towards mastery. So I'm hoping this can feel like a safe space, not only to ask questions, but to make plenty of mistakes, because that's the best way to learn. I already have a question. Can we view the first workshop still if it is recorded? Unfortunately, the recordings aren't available for public use. We use them internally to kind of keep iterating on them and improving on them. And the reason for that is there's quite like a plethora of YouTube videos, of coding videos, of coding lectures available, but we find that there's not a lot of interactive workshops available for students, which is like more of a much better learning experience. So I believe for now, we don't have any intention to distribute these. And as well as if you haven't, if you miss anything, really, all these workshop series are based off of the Introduction to Launch School book that, Introduction to JavaScript book that Launch School puts on their website. So there's no new material that's really being mentioned here. It's just kind of like a way to make it more interactive. So I'm gonna lay down some ground rules. Really, there are no dumb questions, so feel free to ask all the questions you'd like. The one thing I do ask for questions is to direct all the questions to the Zoom's Q&A feature. That's because it just helps me kind of keep track of all the questions, the ones that need to be answered and the ones that have already been answered. That's because the chat is kind of more for idle chit chat and conversations, and it's really easy for a question to get lost there for me. Yeah, just a reminder for everyone to be friendly and professional as well. And something that we've been encountering is spam links. So please do not post any links in the chat or to anyone else directly without explicit permission. If you are being sent a link, I would caution to click it. As I'm the only one who's running this webinar, I'm not able to vet any of these links, and they may be malicious or harmful, so I would honestly advise clicking any links that anybody sends you. Yes. So, where can you find the book you are referencing? Can you provide a link, please? Sure. Let me see. Here we go. I'm going to post the link right there. So that is a valid link I'm posting. Okay, so I highly encourage everyone to code along with the examples I'll be providing, and maybe you can play around with it too, experiment with different results. However, if it's overwhelming to kind of follow along and to code at the same time, then by all means, feel free to just watch along instead. Like, don't stress too much about it. And as I mentioned before, that's because all the material that I'm covering today is in that book that I just posted in the chat. So again, none of this material is new. Like, all that material exists in that book. This is simply an opportunity to make the learning experience a more interactive one. Speaking and following along, I'll be using Amazon Cloud9 web service today. And this is just kind of like an isolated playground coding service. And it's what we recommend for those starting out. But honestly, you can use whatever setup works for you. I personally use VS Code outside of these workshops. I run VS Code on my MacBook. The only thing you really need is you have to have access to a terminal, which is this black box down here, and we need to make sure Node is installed. If you're joining us for the first time on Cloud9 today, you really don't have to set anything up. It should just look similar to the screen I have now, and Node already comes installed with Cloud9, so you're just good to go fresh out of the box. Okay. So today we're going to be covering functions. And then after that, we're going to be looking at how variables come into play with functions, particularly the scope of variables. And the scope refers to what parts of your program in which the variable is accessible. And this is such a key concept. You will run into this no matter what language you're coding in. So this is applicable to JavaScript. And no matter how advanced you get, variable scoping will always come into play. Not only that, but functions are an integral part of programming. So not just in JavaScript too. Almost every programming language will have a way to define a function, albeit sometimes by a different name. I think other places call it methods, like in Ruby, or we have procedures. So it's called functions in JavaScript. You'll be guaranteed to use functions in most. Actually, I want to say you're going to be guaranteed to use functions in all the programs you write. So it's really important to have that solid foundation on how they work and the role that variable scope plays when it comes to your functions. Okay, so let's get started. Just super quick, I'm going to do a quick overview of variables first, and then we'll dive into the functions. So let's make a notes file. You don't have to create this file. I'm just making it so it's a little easier to read for you guys. So variables, right? So variables are a way to store information and data so that we can use and later manipulate it. So way to store information data. Right, so it allows us to label data with a descriptive name. And the way that it works in JavaScript is that we declare variables. We declare variables, and then we assign them a value, right? Also in JavaScript, the modern way to declare variable names is to use the let and the const keyword, right? You might be familiar if you've tried teaching yourself JavaScript with the var keyword, but that's not something we'll be looking at today. There's a lot of nuances and complications with the var keyword that are not worth taking a look at right now. So The modern way to declare variables in JavaScript is with the let and const keyword, and that's what we'll be doing today. And then, so that's how we declare variables, but we use the assignment operator to assign variables a value. Okay. So let's do that in action. What I'm going to do is in my terminal, I'm going to type node, and I'm going to hit enter. And this puts us in the node REPL, the node REPL, which is a really useful tool. It's a JavaScript coding environment. And the really great thing about it is that if I type in an expression, we get the return value right away. So it shows us the output of our code or the result of our code as soon as we enter it. So if I do something mathematical like 5 + 5 and I hit enter, we immediately get the result of that code. If you've run JavaScript before, or if you've played with JavaScript before, you'll know that most of the time we create a JavaScript file and we enter the code in the file, and then we have to run the file in order to see what the code is executing. But this node REPL, again, is a handy tool just to see immediately what the result of our code is. So let's try declaring a variable. I'm going to use the let keyword, let, and I'm going to declare a variable. So that means I'm going to create a container with a descriptive name attached to it. So I'm going to name the variable foo, right? We can see that it's undefined, and that's because whenever we declare a variable, it's not an expression, but it's a statement, which means it doesn't have a return value. We can't capture the return value of this. So that's why we get undefined. Let's assign it, the variable we just declared, a value of 1, right? You can see that we get the return value of 1. The assignment operator returns the value the variable has been assigned to. So in this example, I've declared the variable first and then assigned it a value of 1. But I can do that all in one line. So I can declare another variable and initialize it to the number 2, right? Again, statements return undefined. But if I tried to access each individual variable, so I have foo, it's 1 because we assigned it to 1, and then bar, we assigned it to 2, we'll get those return values. So I can conduct mathematical operations using those variables as well. So I can do foo plus bar, which we know is 1 + 2, and therefore 3. I can also reassign variables. So currently bar is assigned to 2, so I can reassign it to another number. I'm going to assign it to 100. So if I do foo plus bar again now, it should be 101, 1 + 100. Okay. Actually, let's do the rundown first. So I have a diagram here. So what's really happening when you declare a variable, when you use either the const or the let keyword to declare a variable, what happens is that JavaScript somewhere in memory allocates a space. What it's basically doing is it's creating a container in memory, an empty container, and then we're slapping on the label of the variable name. So in this case, it's foo, right? And then when we assign it a value, we're storing that value into the foo container. Okay, so that's what's happening really, like, kind of under the hood. So that goes to say when we declare the bar variable, the same thing is happening. We just did it in one line. So what's happening then is we declare the bar variable, a container is created somewhere in memory, and then we label it with bar. And in this case, we've immediately given it a value, which is 2. So we've stored the number 2 inside the bar variable. So when we evaluate the expression foo plus bar, JavaScript just has to look up the containers in memory, foo and bar, and then be like, okay, so what's inside the foo container? What's inside the bar container? So we know it's 1 + 2. So it's going to evaluate the expression 1 + 2, which we know is 3. What happened when we reassigned bar was that we took out the number 2 and we put number 100 inside that container instead, right? So again, when we evaluate foo plus bar, JavaScript looks up the containers in memory and it says, okay, foo plus bar is 1 + 100, which is 101, okay? So try to think of variables as containers in memory. When we declare the variable, the container is created and it's labeled with the variable name. When we assign a variable, we're storing a value within the container. Okay. So that's a quick overview of variable basics. I think then we can move on to functions. So as I've described before, we use the node REPL, but moving forward, we're gonna be looking at, well, I think we'll still touch on the node REPL a little more, but we're going to be primarily doing most of the work in a JavaScript file. So if you're in the node REPL with me, all you gotta do is type .exit and we'll be back in our terminal. And we're gonna create a JavaScript file. So within our terminal, we're going to write the command touch. So that's the command to create a file. And then we're going to follow it by our file name, which in this case, I'm going to write say. And you'll have to attach the file extension. So .js for JavaScript files. I'm going to hit enter. And then on my left, which is my file directory, you're going to see that say.js has been created. So I'm just going to open that up. And it opened down here. So I'm going to move it up there. And right, this is our JavaScript file. So this is where we're going to be writing JavaScript code. And then once we save the changes to the file, we can run the file and see what happens. Okay. So let's create our first function then. So the thing about functions is that prior to using functions, we actually need to define the function first. So similar to, we can think of JavaScript functions as a procedure, right? So similar to how if we want to perform a procedure, like let's say there's some sort of routine procedure that you conduct, before forming the procedure, you need to define what that procedure is, right? If you don't know what that procedure is, then you're not able to perform it. So let's define the function first. We can define a function using the function keyword. So we're going to write the word function, followed by the function's name. So this can be anything we want it to be, but we want to keep it as descriptive as possible. So here I'm going to write the word say because likely my function is going to say something. And then I'm going to write a pair of parentheses. So there's no space between the name and the parentheses. More on that in a bit. And then lastly, I'm going to hit space and I'm going to have a pair of curly braces. Okay, so I have my function keyword, I have the function name, followed by a set of parentheses that are attached to the function name, and then space, I have a set of curly braces. Okay. Yeah, so this is actually, we've technically completed defining our first function, right? So the important thing to note here is that when we are creating a function, when we're defining a function, what's actually happening underneath the hood is that we're creating a variable in memory with the function name. So this is almost like saying like using the let or const keyword to say to declare the say variable and assigning it to this function. Okay, so remember that if you declare a variable using the function keyword, we're actually declaring a variable in memory, say, and it's being assigned to this function. So two variables with the same name can't actually coexist in the same scope. So if I try to create another variable that says say and assign it to a value like 5, we can already see that the Cloud9 service is kind of giving me a hint that the variable say has already been declared, so I can't use it again. So that's to say defining functions means that the variable, the function name is a variable name, right? So, so if this is our function definition, the code that we want to be part of our function, as in the steps we want to execute in our procedure, is going to be contained within these curly braces, in between these curly braces. And we call this the function body. So for readability, we open up the curly braces like that by hitting enter. So then within our function body, we're going to write some code. Let's do, what we're going to write is console.log. right? This is a built-in predefined function in JavaScript that allows us to write output to the terminal, right? Or log something to the console. It's built into JavaScript, and you'll notice that is because I didn't have to define it anywhere. I had just mentioned that in order to use functions, you'll have to define them first. This is kind of already predefined within JavaScript, so we don't have to define it. So whatever we put in between these parentheses of console.log is going to be output to this terminal. So let's write a string, which is a sequence of characters that represents text data. So we create a string using quotes, double quotes, or backticks surrounded by the text we want to output. So I'm going to write the ever so popular hello world, which is what most people, when they're starting out programming, write. Right, so we have our function declaration. There's the function name. Inside the function body, we've written console.log hello world. So we basically have a function that when we perform the function, it's going to output hello world to the console. Okay, so congrats, you've defined your first function. Now let's run our program and see what happens. So I press Command S on my MacBook to save changes. I think you can go to File, Save here if you want to do it manually. And then we're going to go back into our terminal down below, and we run the file by typing node space and the name of our file, right? And if I hit enter, nothing happens. Okay, so was there something wrong with our code, right? We're supposed to see something output to the terminal, right? But in fact, like nothing is actually wrong with our code here. What happened was that we defined the procedure. We defined the function, right? We defined the steps of the procedure, but we didn't actually perform the procedure. We didn't, how we say, call or invoke the function. That's how we describe using a procedure or using a function in JavaScript. We say we call or we invoke the function. So again, we defined the function, but we didn't call or invoke it. We didn't perform the function. So then let's go back to our code. We can perform the procedure. We can call the function in JavaScript by typing out the function's name. So it's say in this case, followed by the round parentheses brackets, right? Similar like we did inside the function declaration. So then if I save changes to that file again, and I go back to my terminal and I write node say.js. So a useful feature about the terminal is if you simply type, if you hit the arrow key up button, it'll bring back the last command you wrote. And I'm just going to hit enter. And we can see now we get hello world's output to the terminal. Right? Cool. So remember, there's a difference between defining our function and performing our function. Short quiz. What is the output of this code? Note that this is the only code in our JavaScript file. What is the output when we run it? Right, so right, this is just rehashing the example that I've mentioned just now. So let's try running this code. And this annoying thing about slides is that it uses a quotation mark that's not recognized by JavaScript for some reason. Okay, so this is the only code in a file. Let's try running it. And we can see that there is no output, right? Because again, we did not invoke the function. We did not call the function. We simply defined it. If we had invoked the function, then we should see the output, console.log, how do you do? We should see the output, how do you do? Because the console.log method will output that string. So some of you had answered undefined, and you might be confusing undefined for the return value of the function, which we'll be looking at shortly. However, the question explicitly asks, what is the output of this code, which means what is being output to the terminal? And that means not the return value of the function, but what, if any, value is being output to the terminal. So undefined would be an incorrect answer to this question. Okay. Nice. Does anybody have any questions so far? If you do, feel free to throw it into the Q&A and I can certainly get to it at any time. Okay. Awesome. So back to our say function. Okay, cool. So back to our function. So far we have a function that can do one thing, that is log the string hello world, right? But it can't do anything else. So is there a way we can make functions a little more flexible? What if I wanted to log a variety of greetings, right? This is where parameters and arguments come in, right? Parameters and arguments are a way for us to supply data that can be accessed inside the function. In order for us to supply data into the function, though, we need to indicate in the function definition, or in our procedure outline, if you're following that analogy, we need to indicate in our function definition that we want it to take data, right? And this is what parameters are for, right? We define parameters to indicate our function takes data. It can receive data. So then, where we define parameters is right here, right in between the brackets, the parentheses of the function definition. So I'm going to define one parameter, words. And the name of the name of the parameter, just like the function, it can be anything we want it to be. But again, as with function names, we want it to be descriptive. So then I've used the parameter words here because I want my function to log a greeting. So I ideally want some words to be, I want my function to receive some words data, right? So the thing about parameters is that they're actually variables that become assigned to the data that is supplied to the function. And then the data will then be accessible or it'll be made available to use within that function. So what's interesting here is that unlike declaring variables before, when we use the let and const keyword to create variables, for parameters, however, we don't need to use the let or const keywords to declare the variable. We can just write the parameter as it is and it'll create that variable for us, okay? So if this parameter is indicating that this function takes data, and this parameter is a variable that will be assigned to whatever data we pass into it, that means since the words variable is now accessible to us from within the function body, that's what we want to use, right? I want to log whatever data is going to be passed into this function. Whatever data that this function receives is what I want to output to the terminal, right? So then I'm going to then replace my string with words, the variable words. Whatever it's going to be assigned to is what I'm going to output to the terminal. So then what happens if I run this program, right? Again, I'm going to save the changes to the file, and then I'm going to go back into my terminal and write node say.js. If I hit enter, we're going to see that we got the value undefined. Interesting. We did call our function, right? We invoked it. But if we look at our function body, again, it's supposed to log the data that is supplied to the function, which is the value of words. However, we didn't supply any data, right? Even though the parameter indicates that the function should take data, we haven't provided any data. And that's the reason why it logs undefined, which is JavaScript's primitive value that represents an absence of value, right? So then, how do we provide data to the function? How do we supply data? We use arguments. So an argument, if the argument is the data we pass into the function, we actually can pass in the argument when we invoke the function. So on line 5, we invoke the function say, and the data we want to supply can be put in between these parentheses, right? So here I'm going to pass in a string as an argument, again, creating that with double quotes on either side of the string. And this time, if I save the changes and run our program, we should say hello. Okay. I can also call the function multiple times because remember we pass in arguments when we invoke the function. I can invoke the function multiple times then with different arguments, right? So if I run the file now, we can see our variety of greetings that my say function is now flexible to log. Okay. So again, here's our function. Our say function has one parameter words, and within the function body, we're going to be logging the argument words, whatever data is passed into it and parameters is initialized to. We're logging the arguments that are passed into the function. So as I said before, words is actually a variable, right? Parameters is actually a variable that is going to be initialized to the value that we pass into the function invocation. So for example, in this function invocation, I passed in the argument hello, the string hello. That means the parameter is going to be initialized to the string hello. And so therefore, every time from within the function body, we refer to the variable words, it's going to be string hello, right? For that function invocation. And that means we're going to get the hello to the output. This is where students often get quite confused between parameter and arguments. So remember, by definition, parameter is what indicates a function takes data. And by definition, argument is the data we supply to a function, right? But inherently, those are two different things. One indicates that the function will take data, one is the data itself that we're going to put into the function. Therefore, from within the function body, when we're talking about the data, we have to refer to it as an argument. Okay. So this is because if we're simply describing in words what is happening within our function body, I'm going to say we're logging the data that we pass into the function, correct? I wouldn't say something like we're logging what indicates there's going to be data in the function, right? Because that's by definition what a parameter is. It's what indicates that we're going to take data into our function. I would say instead we're going to log the data that is passed into the function. So we're logging the argument. Okay, so the only place this variable is referred to as parameters is up here from within the function definition. That is referred to as parameter. Every other time we refer to the data, whether it's in the function body or outside of the function body, when we're passing in the value, it's referred to as an argument. Okay. Here's an analogy that might help with understanding the differences between parameters and arguments. So we can think of this as a toy box. This box itself is a function, and the holes are parameters, right? If the parameters indicate that a function takes data, then in this analogy, the holes in our box are what indicates that the box takes a shape, right? The fact that there's a hole in it in that shape is what tells me like, okay, I can put a triangle into that hole, right? If there were no holes, then I know like I can't put anything into this box. So we can think of parameters as the holes in our box. These little colorful blocks, these shapes, we can think of these as arguments. That's the data that we're putting into our function or into our box. It's the data that we want to put into our function. So note that when I put these blocks inside the box, when the block is inside the box, aka when the data is inside the function body, I still refer to it as a box. I still refer to it as a block, right? if I put this little colorful shape inside the box, from within the box, I'm still going to call it a triangular shape. I'm not going to call it a hole. The only time I call it a hole is up here, right? So that's the same kind of idea that we're getting with functions. Within our box that indicates that we can put shapes into it, we're going to call it a parameter, but from within the box itself and outside of the box, when we're playing with the shapes, we're going to refer to it as a shape or an argument in this case. Okay. All right. So back to our code here. So it seems like we actually did a lot of work to create this function that expects data, and then we pass it in data, but it doesn't really seem to be that much of a difference from like just initially, like we can just type it out individually, right? Using console.log, right? Really tedious actually. However, there's actually an added benefit here. We've actually extracted the logic to this procedure that makes our program a lot more flexible. What if later we needed to change something within the procedure, right? If I'm going back to my console.log examples, if I wanted to make my greetings more enthusiastic, let's say by maybe adding an exclamation mark, then you're going to have to see here that I'd actually have to go into every single console.log invocation and I have to write the exclamation mark manually myself. However, with our function, the really unique thing, or the really neat thing, is that we can simply just change that. We can just simply make that change in one place. So, for example, let's go again with the exclamation marks. So I can just concatenate an exclamation mark to the data that is going to be passed into the function. And that way, instead of writing the exclamation mark into every single invocation like I had to do with the console.log, I can simply just do it in one place. And now when I run the file, you're going to see that we've appended the exclamation mark to every string that we've passed into our function, right? I can also define more parameters and pass in even more data. So let's say I want our function to take a name as well. I'm going to create another parameter, name, and we separate the parameters within the function definition using a comma. So let's say I want now instead for my function to log the greeting with a space and the name of the value, whatever I happen to pass into it. So then when we invoke, so now our function expects 2 pieces of data. And so far in our function invocations, we've only passed in 1 piece of data. So we can pass in additional information using the same syntax here, separated by a comma. Notice how there's kind of like a parallel here. We have say with parentheses and the 2 parameters separated by a comma. So when we call it, it's the same syntax. We have say with the parentheses and 2 values separated by a comma. So we're going to write, hi, Luke. How do you do, Trevor? And quite all right, Claire. And now if we log this, we're going to say that our function basically computes the new sentence by concatenating the space and the name, and then we get a whole new string output to our terminal. Okay. One more time, parameters and arguments. In our new function, we've indicated that the parameter, we have 2 parameters. So we've indicated that this function takes 2 pieces of data. Again, parameters are variables that will be initialized to whatever data we pass into the function. So here we've passed in the arguments hello and Grace. So that means the parameters will be initialized to hello and Grace. So from within the function body now, we're going to log the value of our arguments concatenated together into 1 string, and that's going to be hello Grace, right? So again, parameters from within the parentheses in the function definition. Everywhere else, arguments. arguments, arguments. Okay. Quiz time again. Please label the parts of the function for me. Which parts are arguments? Which parts are parameters? Okay, so wow, everyone's so fast at entering today. So again, the parameters indicate that our function takes data. So that's parameters here. One is parameters. From within the function body, we're referring to the data as the data that is passed into the function. So number 2, arguments. Number 3 is the data that we passed into the function. So again, arguments. So the correct answer is the second one. It's parameters, arguments, arguments. Cool. Any questions so far? Before I move on to the return value of functions. Okay, cool. Feel free to drop a question if you need, and I can circle back to it at another time. Okay, quick thing. Let's do a quick review of return values in general before I dive into the return values of functions. So in JavaScript, let's go into the node terminal for this, or the node REPL. In JavaScript, actually, pardon me, I'm just going to clear this because it's quite cluttered. So I can type in the command clear, and that will just clear the node for me, or clear the terminal for me. Sorry, I'm mixing up my words so much today. So let's do a quick review of return values. In JavaScript, expressions evaluate to a value. So anything that can evaluate to a value is an expression. Let me demonstrate what that means. So let's do something familiar that we all know. We can do mathematical operations. So something like 7 plus 5. If I hit enter, we get the our result, right? We see what it evaluates to. So we typed in an expression 7 plus 5, and when I hit enter, JavaScript showed us what that evaluated to, or it told us the return value. Those are interchangeable terms, what something evaluates to and what its return value is, right? So what happened was that to perform addition, we used the addition operator and we provided it with 2 operands, which is the values we provide to an operator, one on each side for the addition operator. And when we hit enter, we see that the expression evaluated to 12. And again, this is also called a return value. Another operation I can do is a comparison operation. So I can compare 2 values using the greater than operator, and I'm going to compare the number 123 or 123 with the number 1. And when I hit enter, we can see this expression evaluates to true. The return value of a comparison operation conducted between 123 and 1 returns true. And this is because 123 is greater than 1, right? I don't actually necessarily have to use operators in order to have a return value. For example, any value is an expression that evaluates to itself. So the number 100, for example, if I just hit enter without any operations, returns 100. Number 100 evaluates to 100. The string hello, this isn't just limited to numbers, by the way. If I simply hit enter with that, we get the string hello because it evaluates to itself. We haven't conducted any operations, right? I could also perform string concatenation with the plus operator. So you saw this before. I did a space because it's space sensitive too, and then I put my name. this is an important little gotcha to know. What happens if I put console.log here, right? Remember that console.log is a built-in JavaScript method that allows us to output things to the terminal. So if I log something to the console, let's write something like, this is the output. And if I hit enter, we're going to see two things. So one is the string, this is the output, and that's because that's what we instruct console.log to do. We wanted that string to be output, but then immediately after it, we get this undefined, right? And this is because even though console.log outputs the value we provided, the return value of console.log itself is actually undefined. So console.log does not have a return value, and that's why we get undefined, because undefined represents the absence of a value in JavaScript. So this is the output of console.log, and this is the return value, okay? So then, how does this all relate back to our functions? And that's because all JavaScript function calls are an expression, right? Therefore, all JavaScript function calls evaluate to a value. So all function calls, all function invocations have a return value, okay? Let's see this in action. So I'm going to exit the terminal node REPL, and then let's create a new file this time. So again, I'm going to use the touch command, and I'm going to write, let's name the file return.js. And this is going to create my new file, which I'm going to bring over here. Okay, so let's define a function. Again, we use the function keyword, we write the function name, followed by parentheses, and then curly braces. I'm going to open the function body up. Within the brackets up here, I'm going to define two parameters, num1 and num2. And then from within the function body, I'm going to get the result of num1 plus num2. Okay. So I'm going to add the two arguments there like that with the addition operator. So I want to see the result of our code, right? So far we've done these operations, we've conducted these mathematical operations, but we haven't output it to the terminal. So when I run this file, I actually won't see anything. So I'm going to write, so first I'm going to invoke the function with two arguments, 7 and 5. And then in order to see what's happening, in order to see that, I'm going to wrap that entire expression within a console.log, right? If I just call it, there's no console.log anywhere in this function. So it's going to run, but JavaScript is going to do the math and it's just going to sit there. And it's kind of the equivalent of being like, hey, like JavaScript, I asked you to do some math for me. Why aren't you telling me the answer? And JavaScript will respond with like, you didn't tell me to tell you the answer. Like I did the math in my head, but I didn't tell you the answer. So if we want to see the answer, we're going to have to wrap it in a console.log method call. So let's try running our file. Node return.js, and when I hit enter, we get undefined. Okay. So why did we get undefined here? Again, that's the primitive value that represents an absence of value, right? And we got undefined here because the default return value of a function invocation is actually undefined, right? Let's write that down. Function return values. The default return value of a function invocation is undefined, right? This is referred to as the implicit return value of a function call. Okay. However, that's not really useful to us right now, right? Like I can't really do anything with that. And what I wanted from this function was for it to calculate the mathematical addition of these two numbers that I provided it. So it'd be nice if I can actually get the result of that and do something meaningful with it, right? So how do we explicitly return a value from a function? We use the return keyword. So I want to return what this evaluates to. So before that expression, I'm simply going to write return. okay? Now, when I run the file, we should get the result of our function, which is 7 plus 5. What this function did then was calculate the sum of the arguments, 7 plus 5, and then it returns that value to us. So because it returned that value to us, this evaluates to 12, and that's what we get output to our terminal. Okay. Yeah, really important there. Let me see, do I have a quiz for this? Let me just go through return values again. So again, we evaluated an expression and we saw its return value. This is earlier within the node REPL. And then so we can say that sum, the function call with the 2 arguments, this is also an expression. So it will evaluate to something. Before we put in the return keyword, it evaluated to undefined. But now that we have an explicit return value from the function, the return value of this expression, what this expression evaluates to, is now 12. Okay, and then we wanted to log that. So then we wrapped it in a console.log. Okay. Any questions so far? We're running close to time. I think I'm just going to be able to get through one more topic, which is how to define a function in 3 different ways. And we're going to see a couple nuances between those 3 different ways to define the function. So let's create a new file for this. So I'm going to go back into terminal, touch, and I'm going to write multiply.js. Actually, pardon me, I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to write touch multiply -1.js because I'm going to create one file for each way to define a function. So as I've just mentioned, there's actually multiple ways to define a function. The way we've been using thus far to define a function is called a function declaration. So if I write double dashes, this is considered a comment in JavaScript. So I can write a comment here and it won't affect our JavaScript code at all. This is a good way to explain a little bit of our code. So this is going to be a function declaration, right? So remember, like the way that we've been defining functions so far is to use the function keyword, and then we put the function name. This time it's going to be multiply, and then we put the parentheses and our curly braces, right? So we have kind of like 3 sections. We have the name of our function, we have a place where there's going to be parameters, and we have the function body. So for this, I'm going to have 2 parameters, factor1 and factor2. And then in the function body, I'm simply going to return the mathematical operation of factor1 and factor2 multiplied together. And we do that using the asterisk operator, that one there. As before, I'm going to pass in 2 numbers because that's what our function expects. And in order to see what I'm doing, I'm going to wrap that expression in a console.log, right? We have an explicit return value. So this should return multiply 1.js, it should return 50, right? Right, so that's our function declaration. As we mentioned, in our function declaration, we have our function name, which is a variable, don't forget that. We have the area for parameters, and then we have our function body, which is between those curly braces. There are really 2 characteristics that make a function declaration a function declaration. So let's write that here, 2. Actually, I'll write this in the notes, and because someone asked, I think, to see them at the end. So yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So for function declarations, there's two distinct characters that make it a function declaration. So the first is the use of the keyword function at the very beginning of the line. So function keyword has to appear at the very beginning of the line. Okay. As long as the function word appears at the very beginning of the line, it's considered a function declaration. The second unique thing about function declarations is that I can actually invoke the function before it's defined. So can invoke a function declaration before it's called. Okay, maybe not the best way to say that. We can invoke a function that's been defined with a function declaration before it's been called, before it's defined. Right. So we can invoke the function before it's defined if that function was defined within the format of a function declaration. So you can actually see this in action if I move this console.log statement, because we are calling the function here, right? So you're going to see that this actually still works, interestingly enough. Okay. Let's look at another way to define a function. I'm going to write another file, multiply-2. Oops, multiply-2. Here, our second way to define a function is called a function expression, right? So the way I'm going to do this is actually I'm going to declare a variable using the let keyword, and I'm going to assign it to an expression here. So it's going to be function, but instead of giving it a function name, I'm going to go straight into the parameters, and then I'm going to go into the function body and hit enter on that. So again, let's define the same parameters, factor1 and factor2, and we can see our function body is still here. So within the function body, I'm going to do return factor1 times factor2. And then again, I'm going to call the function. The function calls always remain the same, doesn't change. It's just the function definition that's changing. So again, I'm going to try and log the value of that expression of the function invocation, right? And we can try running the file and it's going to have the exact same output, right? So for our function, remember that our function declaration had really like 3 essential parts. It had the function name, which was a variable. It had the parameters and it had the function body. So for a function expression, we can see the exact same thing really happening here. We have the variable, which is the function name. We have parameters and we have the function body, right? It's not a function declaration because as we mentioned before, the function keyword doesn't appear at the beginning of the line, right? In our function declaration, it was the very first thing that appeared on the line, on line 4. On line 3 here, it's the let keyword. So this is not a function declaration. This is a function expression. And again, we can attempt to call this. Remember that another unique feature of function declarations was that if we try and call it before the function definition, it worked. However, with function expressions, we get an error. It does not work. So we can't call, the only function we can call before its definition is a function declaration. Function expressions, we can't. Okay, so reference error, we cannot access multiply before initialization. That's because multiply was initialized at line 5 and we're attempting to calling it before that at line 3. Okay, last one here. Node, sorry, touch multiply -3.js. Okay. So this one is an arrow function. So we have the same thing here. We're going to do let multiply equals, and instead of the function keyword, we're just going to go straight into the parameters. I'm going to do factor1, factor2. And then we have our function body, and to connect our parameters and our function body, we create an arrow with the equal sign and the greater than operator sign. Right, I'm going to open that up and same thing, return factor1 times factor2. And then again, as I mentioned before, the function invocation does not change. And I want to see what the function invocation outputs, so I'm going to wrap it in a console.log. save the changes, and run our file. Right, it's 5, not 50. Right, 50. So again, our arrow function, it has the same essential 3 parts. It's going to have the function name, which is a variable, it has the parameters, and it has the function body. Just the way syntax is written is a little different. Similar to the function expression and function declaration, I can attempt to call it before, but we're going to see that it does not work. Again, we get another error, the same one as before, because we can't only function declarations we can call before their definition. And again, this doesn't start with the function keyword, so it's not a function declaration because we're using the arrow where it's going to be an arrow function. Okay, so there's one unique gotcha about arrow functions that we definitely need to know. And earlier we said that unless a function explicitly returns a value using the return keyword, then its return value will always be undefined. However, this is not the case if your arrow function's function body is a single line expression. So in this case, we do actually have a single line expression. So it's factor 1 times factor 2. And we've explicitly used a return keyword here. However, because we have a single line expression, what we can do is actually we can omit the curly braces and simply write factor 1 times factor 2. And if we, based on what we know so far about the return keyword, this should return undefined. However, when we run the program, we can see that it actually still returns 50. And that's because the arrow function has this feature called the single line implicit return. And that's when our expression within our function body is a single line, and therefore we can omit the curly braces. So once the curly braces have been omitted, that means whatever this expression evaluates to will be implicitly returned. So functions. Similar to well, arrow functions are actually technically a type of function expression. So how shall I write this? Well, the most important thing we're trying to isolate right now is the fact that it has a single line expression or a single line implicit return feature, which is if function body is single line expression, we can omit the curly braces for the function body, which will lead to the function returning the whatever that expression evaluates to, right? So note that the arrow function is the only one that has this feature. And if, let's say, even if it's a single line expression, if we put it in curly braces, we have to use the return keyword. This only works if, we can see we get undefined here. This only works if you omit the curly braces, and the only way you can omit a curly brace for an arrow function is if we have a single line expression. So you can see now I omitted the curly braces, and when I run the file again, I get the implicit return value of this expression here. Okay. So I'm aware I'm a little over time. I'm just going to wrap up really quickly. So that's a lot of material, I would say, about how to define a function. And I think a lot of questions may arise about which function is best, which type should I use? And to answer that, I'm going to say at this point, it's really not important which you use, as there are actually so many more nuances and differences between the three different ways that you'll explore in much later courses. For the sake of the prep course and JS 101, I would say the best thing to do is just simply become familiar with all three types and their differences, rather than choosing the one that is the most efficient or the best for your program. So it's important that you have an understanding of all three and that you're able to recognize the different syntax that they have and also the different features that they have. Okay. I'm happy to show my notes at the very end. I'm just gonna go through one more quiz and then I usually stick around for 5 to 10 minutes to answer any questions and to go over any notes that you might miss. Let's see. Right. So what is the return value of this function invocation? Yeah, cool. So everyone's got it. It's we have an explicit return because of the return keyword, and therefore this function invocation, we passed in the string wow. Within our function body, we concatenate the string wow with 3 exclamation marks, and then we explicitly return that what that evaluated to, which is wow with 3 exclamation marks. Cool. Let's make it a little trickier. So some of these quizzes I've made intentionally tricky, so don't be too discouraged if you don't get them. I'm not sure, actually. I have the tricky ones in here. Okay. What is the return value of this function invocation? Okay, that one got a couple people. So let's break down what's happening. Actually, let's just copy paste it and I'll break down what's happening. Right, so what's happening here is I've defined a function called toNumber, and it's an arrow function. So it takes one parameter string, and it has a single line expression, which is coercing the string to a number. So remember for the arrow function, we do have our single line implicit return function, so it should return whatever this evaluates to. And what this evaluates to, number with the string 256, will convert that string into a number. So it'll be 256. So therefore the return value of this expression is 256. And that means the number 256 and not the string 256. And that means the, here, let me console.log this so we'll see. That means what this function invocation evaluates to is the number 256. Okay, so there's a difference between the number 256 and the string 256, so be cautious about that. Okay, last. Okay, I don't think I had the really tricky ones in here, but yeah. What is the return value of this function invocation? What is the return value of the function invocation? I'll give it 5 to 10 more seconds. Okay, this one stumped a lot of people, so oops. Let's go through it together. So we have a pretty much almost exact same function as the previous example, except this time it's not a function, it's not an arrow function. We're using a function expression because I don't see the arrow and it's using the function keyword, but it's not at the very beginning of the line. So that means it's a function expression. So same thing, it's going to evaluate this expression number with the string. The string we pass into it is the string 256, and then this method will explicitly coerce that string into a number. So we should get this expression evaluates to the number 256. However, we aren't using the return keyword. So remember that unless we explicitly use the return keyword, the return value of a function invocation is always going to be undefined. And the one exception for that is if we're using the arrow function single line implicit return feature, which means that A, we're using an arrow function, and B, the expression of the function body is a single line expression, and 3, we're not using curly braces. So that's not the case here, right? So that means when we run the function, we don't get anything because I didn't wrap this in a console.log. So when we wrap the console.log around that function invocation, and now if we run it, we get undefined. Correct answer is undefined. Okay. It's a lot of information, so don't be discouraged if you didn't get it right. There's a lot happening here right now. Nice. So thanks so much for staying behind. I know I went over a little bit, but yeah, I hope you guys all learned something. Please fill out this feedback form. It's really helpful for us to get an understanding of what's working and what's not working with these workshops. Lets us know what you guys want and what we can maybe better cater towards you in the future. If you are attending next week, I'll be doing at the exact same time, I'll be doing flow controls and loops. So that's if else statements and for loops, while loops. Yeah, so if those are really confusing to you, I know loops were like really difficult for me when I first started. I have some great diagrams that will like really break that down for us. So yeah, I'll see you there if you're attending. And otherwise, if you're sticking around to ask a couple questions, like I'll be around for maybe around the next 5 to 10 minutes or however many questions there are. Yeah, thank you so much for attending. I think someone wanted these notes, right? So I can have this out here. Let me know if there's a specific section because there's the variable section and then we have the function section. Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your evening or day wherever you are. Okay, yes, so question. So there were 2 parts to this question, I think. So is that invoking or instantiating the variable? So this is invoking the function because this variable is assigned to this function. So when we are invoking the function, instantiating a variable, I'm not sure what that term means because we are initializing. So here, let to number means we declare the variable, and then using the assignment operator within that same statement means that we're initializing the variable to a function. So this variable now references a function. And then on this line here, we're invoking that function that is referenced by that variable. Because we don't remember that, let me see, do I have a diagram for this? Remember that in order to return a value from a function, we have to use this return keyword. We have to explicitly use this return keyword, otherwise, and this goes for every function except for the arrow function when it doesn't have a curly brace. So let's simply use this one as an example. I'm going to call this function, and this function has an explicit return value. We use the return keyword. So let's run this file, multiply-2.js. We're going to get what happens is we passed in two values. We passed in 10 and 5 as an argument. So within the function body, it found the result of 10 times 5, and it returned that to us. However, if we don't have a return value, if we don't use the explicit return keyword, then the default return value of all function invocations is going to be undefined. So you can see that I took off the return keyword, and now we get undefined. So unless the return keyword is there to tell us explicitly what value we want from the function, then the function will always return undefined, right? The only exception to that is if we have an arrow function, and as I mentioned before, if the arrow function has curly braces, we run into the same problem. We need the return keyword. If we don't have the return keyword, it's going to be undefined. However, the one exception, oops. Oh, right, I'm running the wrong file, right? It's undefined because I don't have the return keyword there. However, the one exception to this rule is that if I have a single line expression, so factor 1 times factor 2 is just one line expression, then I can actually omit the curly braces for an arrow function, and I can just simply have it like this, right? And this, when we have an arrow function with one single line expression and no curly braces, it actually just returns the result of this expression, even though we didn't use the return keyword. So again, if I run the file, we see 50. Curly braces and no return keyword, undefined. Curly braces with the return keyword, the expression return value. Okay. So for this example, it's not an arrow function. It was a function expression with the curly braces, and we did not use the return keywords. That means automatically the return value is undefined no matter what we put in there. Okay. Good question. Yes. And then I'll write something about function expression. So also these notes, like I mentioned before, that JavaScript book has everything that you really need. Like everything I wrote in the slides is all based on that introduction to JavaScript book available on Launch School's website. Yeah. Not begin with. Cool. Any other questions for me today? I think that's about it for today. If you have any other further questions, contact me through the Launch School Slack. If you're not in the Slack, I would highly suggest joining it. It's a really good community. Everyone's there to help each other out, and it will definitely help you with learning if you're on the Launch School journey. Or if you just want to ask questions in the Slack too, that's a great place to get in touch with everybody. So my name is Grace Lim, and then I have the T8 designation. The Slack channel is available on the Launch School website. So if you go to Launch School, that's not Launch School. If you go to launchschool.com and you go to chat room, I think this is the Slack link here. So you click chat room, and it'll give you instructions on how to join the Slack. Okay. Again, if there's something you might have missed in what I've taught today, all the material that I mentioned is all here available on the Launch School website. for in the Introduction to JavaScript book. I literally took this and made the entire lesson plan. So everything is available here. This function section is everything in this function section here is exactly how it is just basically what I put in verbal form today. So if you need a refresher, it's always available for everyone, even if you're not in the prep course. Awesome. Yeah, and then Slack channel in the chat room button there. Yeah. I think that's about all the questions for today. Thanks so much for attending, and I hope to see you next week. Take care.